Welcome to the Wade Center Podcast,
a podcast of Wheaton College.
I'm a huge fan. You got to sleep in between creative drafts. Your brain will solve problems for you while you're sleeping, I'm convinced. But I did this over and over, and it just wasn't working. And then I did a draft. I read it the next morning, and I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but it made me cry. Yeah. And I was like, but up until that point, I was like, this is not work. This concept is too saccharine. It's going to end the whole book on this like goofy note. It was depressing because I felt like if that didn't work, it invalidated the whole concept.
Welcome, friends, to another episode of the Wade Podcast. I'm Jim Beitler, here once again with co-host and podcast producer Aaron Hill. Today we are joined in studio with award-winning author and illustrator John Hendrix, who is here to talk about his new book, The Mythmakers, The Remarkable Fellowship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Welcome, John.
Glad to be here.
So John is an associate professor who teaches illustration and typography in the Sam Fox School of Art and Design at Washington University in St. Louis. He's written a lot of books: The Faithful Spy, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and the Plot to Kill Hitler. That was called a Best Book of 2018 by NPR. Drawing is Magic, Discovering Yourself in a Sketchbook, and Miracle Man, The Story of Jesus. And his illustrations have appeared all over the place. Entertainment Weekly, Sports Illustrated, Newsweek, Rolling Stone, New Yorker, New York Times, National Geographic. He's won 3 silver medals from the Society of Illustrators, which also recently named him the Distinguished Educator in the Arts for 2024.
Wow.
This guy sounds awesome.
I know, right?
John, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed The Mythmakers.
Oh, thank you.
The narrative is compelling. The illustrations are enchanting. And there's exposition. I mean, readers are going to learn something.
Yeah, I hope so.
From this book. It's a beautiful book. So you've got narration, you've got depiction, you've got exposition. They're all working well. Where did the idea for this book come from? And did it start out as a kind of balance of those 3 things? Is that how it began, or did that emerge in the process?
I wanted to make this book because I'm a fan, and I owe these 2 men so much in my own creative practice. And so it really did start out as kind of fan art for their world that they shared together. And so I had always really believed that the 2 of them sort of sub-created 3 things together. They did Middle-earth and Narnia, of course, which have been illustrated a gazillion times. But then the third thing they sub-created was the Inklings, basically. And that's almost just as much as of a fantasy world as Narnia and Middle-earth. but that had never really been fully illustrated. I'm a professor. I have friends who are also professors. I rarely go to the pub with them to read poetry together, right? But we all sort of have that vision of the literary life shared with your friends in a dark pub talking about the great ideas in the world. And I wanted to bring that to life.
Oh, amazing. So in some ways, it's a well-trod story.
It is.
The friendship of Lewis and Tolkien. But you've given it fresh life through illustration. I wonder if you could speak to this. Like, why do we need this story? And why do we need the story illustrated?
I thought of every time I sat down to work on this. I was like, what could I possibly add to this? Like, so many amazing books have written about these folks, and to me, again, the way I came to it was a love of images, a love of drawing. And I think something happens when you put words and images together that unlocks a different kind of language in the mind of readers. And I've had several adults come to me after reading this book that said, I knew their story, but there was something about seeing it, reading it together that gave me a new kind of synthesis of what their shared fellowship was about. And so I think that's the power of the graphic novel, is that kind of language between words and pictures that happens almost entirely in your mind.
In some ways, I found that to be true in the story for sure. And one of the things that really comes out in the book is just how important Lewis and Tolkien were to the whole 20th century, to pop culture in the 20th century, to the literary form, to fantasy in the 20th century. Could you speak to that a little bit?
It's really not overstating the case that without them meeting, the 20th and 21st century would look a lot different in terms of visual culture and literature. From their basically chance meeting. They sold 250 million copies of their books. They're still being reinterpreted. Greta Gerwig is doing Narnia. We just had Rings of Power, right? Like their work had such power. And you could make an argument that Lord of the Rings specifically, along with Star Trek, I think in the 60s, basically invented fan culture that we know of today. You know, in the 60s, it was like the idea of a professor from Oxford in his 70s leading a lifestyle fad is insane. But that's exactly what it was. People had merch and shirts. Frodo lives, Gandalf for president, Tolkien is hobbit forming. Like all of these like proto memes basically began to emerge in the culture thanks to Lord of the Rings.
Well, even the idea, we don't talk about it a whole lot, but even the idea that you could actually communicate with an author about what they've created, the amount of letters that were written to at least Lewis about Narnia and all of the ways that he responds to these little kids and stuff. Like, this is before the internet. This is, like truly analog, handwritten letters. But the idea that you could just pick up a thing and write a letter to the author of your favorite book, and then they would just respond to you.
They both felt a kind of obligation to respond to these letters, too.
Yeah, but these days with the internet, you kind of feel like you can do that. But I remember, at least when I was growing up, it was in that age of like fan mail. But you knew that you were sending something to a P.O. box somewhere. Some assistant was going to look through it.
Exactly.
They were never actually going to read it, And so we've kind of gotten back to that with, some of the social media and stuff. But that idea of connecting directly with authors and feeling like you know them in a way, I think is also something that's kind of underrated.
I tell people to read Tolkien's letters because it's some of the places where he really explains the deep mythology of his legendarium in ways that are very graspable, where, like, if you read the Silmarillion, it's like reading the Old Testament of Middle-earth, right? Like, you got to want to understand it.
Oh, yeah.
But in the letters, he just, like, explains what he's trying to do, and they're really super interesting. And of course, he's sometimes answering criticism or answering confusion from people. Yeah. And he and Lewis both felt a ton of obligation to write people back.
Yeah. So the title of your book is Mythmakers. I wanted to ask you about this element of it, which is, what is a myth, and how can you make a myth? Do you think that all of these properties, these intellectual, these book series and TV series, are they making myths as well? What was, obviously we could talk about Tolkien's definition, from On Fairy Stories, which I think is a good starting point. But how does that translate into the things that we're currently seeing? Like, what were they making? What was that impact? And then what do you think that idea of a myth looks like in our sort of modern context?
Yeah, I mean, the book actually tries to do a little bit of that for middle grade readers. Like, what exactly is a myth? And when we hear the word myth, we should not think of it as a synonym with something that is untrue, or this is a lie, or this is made up, right? This is the Christian aversion to, like, somebody says, well, Genesis is a myth, and people are like, no, it's not, it's true, right? And people throw the podcast out the window. Well, if we take Tolkien's idea of the myth, his concept was like God was laying the groundwork throughout all these stories that humanity was telling one another. Like, oh, there it is. There's that story. There's that story. There's that story. So then when the story finally occurs in real life, the humanity was like primed to understand it. So we would see it and go, there it is. That's that story I've heard over and over again. The Corn King, the Balder, all of the myths touch on this thing that finally rings true when it comes to Earth. And that's the argument that convinced Lewis, basically.
Yeah.
Because Lewis was dealing with, like, he loved these stories, but ultimately thought they were lies, and lies were worthless.
Well, and especially if there's other versions of that story, why are we to believe that this dying and rising God story is any different than the Corn King or these other things? Yeah, definitely.
Exactly.
So that was the argument then. How does that translate into them as myth makers and then their legacy moving on? Yeah,
well, again, it's you have to remember, they did not know they were the C.S. Lewis and the J.R.R. Tolkien. They were not trying to make a project for the 21st century. They were just like, why don't these stories exist that take them seriously and are made for people like us? And they're just like, I think we can do this.
Yeah.
And then they just happened to touch on, I think, just this very Jungian idea of the archetypes. And why did their stories resonate? I think it was a product of just a cultural moment right after World War II. The world had been kind of disenchanted after 2 world wars and the Depression. And I just think their myths resonated with a desire for the miraculous and the grand. And they just landed in a world, I think, that was ripe for that. And I think that's why they persisted.
Okay.
And they developed it. What do you think of the outgrowths of their myth making? Like you mentioned the Rings of Power or Lord of the Rings movies. As an illustrator, what do you think of those?
Well, what's hilarious is Tolkien in On Fairy Stories passionately argues the worst thing you can do with a fantasy story is illustrate it, because it robs the reader of the world building. Now, of course, it takes you about 30 seconds to realize that Tolkien himself illustrated his own works.
Yeah.
Okay, so the man, first of all, was a total conundrum. And he never liked anything.
Very strong opinions that he contradicted all the time.
Of course.
Yeah.
And people are always like, but he hated Narnia. I'm like, he hated everything. Like, he never liked anything else that was made that was not.
Yeah.
So you have to put he hated Narnia in a category of just like, he was kind of a grump, you know? But yes, so the illustrated version of these, I think Lord of the Rings has created its own kind of visual culture that you see, you basically can't escape it. Like the idea that you would leave it to reinvent it, we all sort of think like, well, I think we're kind of missing the essential Tolkienian vision of what a swords and magic movie would look like. And I think that visual culture actually all goes back to Tolkien.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that this is in some ways for middle grade readers. But I guess I'd push back a little against that a little bit, because I just love this book, and as did my 10-year-old son Arnie. Arnie was reading this and loving it. So lots of different audiences are going to dig this. Yeah, I think. But I do think that oftentimes, and Lewis and Tolkien talk about this, fantasy is often labeled as being for children.
Right.
And I think picture books, too, are often labeled as being, labeled as for children. So you've got kind of a double whammy here, like that this is like kind of for children. How do you respond to that? Do you ever get that criticism?
Yeah, and when I say my books are written for middle grade, Harry Potter was written for middle grade, and it of course transcended that audience. I think because it was done really well.
Yeah.
So my books, what I love doing is taking something really complex and making it legible, right? Putting a handle on something that is really complicated and giving people a usable history to understand.
Yeah.
And so that's when I write for a young audience, that is what I'm longing to do. Now, of course, the act of translation is something everyone loves and needs. And the idea that you don't have to read 8 150-page books to get a sense of their story, that you can do it in a visual, synthesized way that is kind of like watching a movie because it's so visual. It's thinking about an arc of a story. Like that is something that human beings latch onto because it is so story-like. The narrative is what locks it into our brain. So that's when I'm thinking about middle grade, that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Just hearing you talk made me think of Tolkien's poem about myth making that he writes to Lewis.
In response to Lewis, yeah.
And Lewis saying myths are lies, though breathed through silver. And I thought it's kind of a complicated poem.
It really is.
But I thought you did just such a beautiful job illustrating that and weaving it into that famous walk, Addison's walk, and that when the wind comes through on the page, it's just a beautiful moment in the book.
Well, they describe that happening. I mean, that conversation that, again, Tolkien did not convert Lewis, but he was the key in the lock that cracked the door just enough. And that, they describe that conversation, many scholars have, as like one of the most significant single conversations of the 20th century, which I love thinking about as a category. I don't even know what else is on that list, but
that would be fun to make that list.
It would, right?
Yeah. That sounds like a good project for the Wade podcast.
That sounds like a good podcast, actually.
Okay, I'll work on that and get back to you. But yeah, that single conversation, I'd read about it. Of course, the poem gives you a little hint of it.
Right.
But part of in this book, I'd never seen someone try to recreate what it felt like to be in that conversation. And I really wanted to do that with this book without making fan fiction Like all the times when Lewis and Tolkien are together talking about something that I'm recreating a conversation, I'm sourcing that from, I know this conversation happened, with the exception of some artistic license at the end.
Ooh, could I ask about that?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, boy. So Tolkien and Lewis had a cooling off at the end of their relationship and lives.
To say it mildly.
Yeah. And you illustrate that. And then at the end, you give them, I would call it a kind of eucatastrophe.
Oh, you win. You picked it out.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is, it's you give them this conversation, this conversation after death, basically.
Yeah.
Why was that important to do that?
Oh, man. I was on the fence about it. Like, it's exactly, I'm telling a story where Tolkien and Lewis are obsessed with the eucatastrophe. Tolkien believes the eucatastrophe, for those of you who don't know, it's the opposite catastrophe. And Tolkien saw Easter as the primary eucatastrophe. Maximum sorrow followed by maximum joy, back to back. And he was so obsessed with this that it's all over Lord of the Rings. I mean, it's actually one of the criticisms of the book. There's too much of it. But I mean, it's Éowyn and the Witch King. It's Gandalf at Helm's Deep. It's the Eagles. Like it's endless, right?
Yeah.
But it's because he was obsessed with it.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, yes. So as I'm writing this book about them, I feel like, how can I not give them their own eucatastrophe? But of course, it takes a lot of artistic license, and I really did not want it to feel saccharine or cheap. So I wrote drafts and drafts and drafts of things. I wanted to feel like it could be an actual conversation that they would have in their voice that allowed them to meet kind of on the shores before they enter the new earth. And it ends up backcoding the whole book, where it's sort of like they're in a holding place, and I'm not going to say purgatory, but they're in a place where they're sort of sorting through their legacy together before they come into the new kingdom. But yeah,
it's a beautiful moment in the book.
Yeah.
You kind of talked a little bit about your process there for a second, and you said you kind of went through lots of drafts.
Yeah.
I'm just fascinated by our artist process.
Yeah.
Oh, me too. I love. Let's do process.
Yeah,
talk.
I wanted to ask you about this as well.
Okay.
Yeah, like what did you? How did you decide what to include, what to draw, and what to leave out? Because there's obviously, like you said, there's been a lot of books been written about their friendship and their collaboration and stuff like that. How do you decide what makes it into the book? What do you visualize? What did you want to set up as far as, like you were talking about creating sort of an Inklings visualization, which hasn't really existed.
Yeah.
How did that process work of deciding what made it into the book and what didn't?
I mean, the first thing anyone should know is that it's a total mess. I mean, the process, it's a disaster.
Are there fantastic illustrations that you didn't include in the book?
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's I mean, the hardest part of any book is cutting stuff out and leaving things out. And there's tons of stuff I didn't include. And it looks so clear when you have it done. And it's like, this had to have come to him in sort of a vision, and he just manifested it. And it's never like, I mean, this was a 5-year project, and I had the sort of idea of, this would make a great story. How am I going to make a 300-page graphic novel about 2 Oxford professors that basically talked? Like, that's what they did.
Yeah.
Like, you can't make that interesting.
Yeah.
So
a lot of text bubbles.
Yeah, and like there's some of that in the book, but like you can't have an entire graphic novel of that.
Yeah.
So that's when the wizard and lion avatar idea came in, and it was like, okay, these two could have some of the adventures that allow me to do a little fan art, allow me to have some fun, have the readers have fun, and then they can maybe make some visual metaphors too. So that's what unlocked the idea. And then it was like the concept sort of wrote itself into a draft that I was convinced was brilliant. And then, of course, this is any creative knows, as soon as you take that brilliant idea and try to make it real, it's instantly bad. And I call it the pit of despair. You fall down this cliff into this pit where you're like, everything about the idea was garbage. I'm garbage. I will never succeed at this. And the temptation is then to say the idea was bad. I should find a new idea. But every artist knows, anyone who's made anything, you have to climb out of that pit very slowly. And so that's what it is. It's making little drawings, writing a little bit, testing it out. And like the ending sequence, I wrote drafts where I would go to bed. I'm a huge fan. You got to sleep in between creative drafts. Your brain will solve problems for you while you're sleeping. I'm convinced. But I did this over and over, and it just wasn't working. And then I did a draft. I read it the next morning, and I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but it made me cry. Yeah, and I was like, but up until that point, I was like, this is not work. This concept is too saccharine. It's not working. It's going to end the whole book on this like goofy note. It was depressing because I felt like if that didn't work, it invalidated the whole concept of it. But.
There's such a gravity to the book as a whole. There, one thing that I kind of noticed, a kind of motif running through it, was the kind of when Lewis's mother passes away in the book, when Tolkien is in the trenches, and then later when Joy dies, you draw their heads as half submerged. So, like Lewis has this quote in "Surprised by Joy," where after his mother died, he basically says. It was all sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis. And so we get this image of Lewis underwater, basically, half underwater, with just his eyes above. And then Tolkien in the trenches.
In the trenches, that's true, yeah.
Like this. And then when Joy passes away, Lewis's head is framed in a box. And again, it's just the top, it's just his eyes. And I was wondering about that. Like, why was that an image of grief for you?
Yeah. No, that's a great connection to make. I actually had not made that connection before. I think it's probably just some of those visual metaphors that ends up echoing through any artist's like library. I just like it as a visual image.
Yeah.
But no, you're totally right. I mean, the whole arc of the story is kind of. I mean, people have emailed me and been like, I didn't know that their friendship deteriorated, and like it really bummed me out to like I had to put the book down at one point because I was like sad. And to me, it makes for actually a more resonant story that like we live in a place where right now there are no happy endings. Like we are wrestling with loss and unresolved grief, and that their friendship went through that same arc, sort of waiting for every sad thing to come untrue. Like that made the story more poignant to me. So I think you got to go head on at the hard stuff for it to really work.
Wait, back to process. Do you collaborate with people on things? Do you share ideas as part of that, or what does that look like? Or is it a more solitary thing?
It's a mix. I think all art gets better in community. So I think sharing things, giving it to somebody who can read a draft and be like, yeah, I get it. I don't get it. I've got friends that have read drafts. My editor, of course, I trust very greatly. I mean, he gave me the note, like in the book, there are these portals that take you to basically dense illustrated footnotes in the back. So now initially those were inside the story itself. And he read this and he was like, there is no way that this history of fairy tale should suddenly like be inside of the story. And I'm like, no, it's essential. And he's like, you got to come up with a way to get it out of the story. So the doors were already a motif in the book at that point. So then I added a new like choose your own adventure style door that takes you to the back of the book. And, that was all my editor's prompting. So again, when you're left to your own devices, oftentimes, as George Lucas showed all of us in the Star Wars prequels, sometimes you need someone. So you need someone to just say no once in a while.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or to make your ideas better.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, that is
and actually,
hard.
I've watched the prequels recently, and I think they got more criticism they deserve. But there is something to limitations. That as artists, we need limits to make our best work.
Yeah, definitely. So let me ask you a question. Obviously, you knew about their friendship and their relationship going into this. What did your research process look like? What did you learn? What did you discover about them and their friendship and its impact that excited you, energized you as you were working on the project? Did you like look at, any primary sources? Like, what did your research process look like? What that discoveries?
I really rely on actual scholars. I think of myself as an artist, and this is a work of art that I'm using secondary sources mostly. Now, I did look at some stuff at the Bodleian. I did a research trip to Oxford. But again, I'm not scouring primary sources trying to create new scholarship, right? I'm taking existing knowledge and synthesizing that in a narrative way. But yes, I learned a ton. I mean, I knew the general shape like most people do. Like, oh yeah, they were friends. They were, bros basically. But I did not realize the depth of their connection, that they were truly Jonathan and David for 25 years of their life. And that I personally don't believe they would have made any of their works without the other, their most significant works. I mean,
that's a hot take.
I think there is an alternate universe where Tolkien dies and they find 10,000 pages of mythology in a drawer. And they're like, whoa, this like philologist had this weird hobby where he invented languages. Like, I think Lewis himself was the reason why it ever made it to print, because the guy was such a noodler. He was so self-deprecating, and he wanted at one point to rewrite all of The Hobbit to make it an adult story so that it matched. When he got stuck on Lord of the Rings, he was like, you know what I should do? I should go back and rewrite all of The Hobbit. So like this was his thinking.
And he did rewrite some of it.
He did. Yeah. Well, in the updated version, that's where he compromised. He's like, okay, I won't rewrite the whole story. But he ultimately thought writing The Hobbit for young people was a mistake, right? Which is Lewis and Tolkien crossed directions in the way that, because Lewis started with the space trilogy and went to more of a kid-lit space, and Tolkien went the other direction, which is part of why I think
that initial wager of like writing like, oh, I'll write a science fiction story and I'll write a time travel thing. I think that also played a really key role there. Yeah.
Right. Because Lewis, on the bet, they famously had a wager at the Eagle and Child. Heads, Lewis gets space travel, tails, Tolkien gets time travel. And Lewis instantly writes basically a trilogy that's published.
Yeah.
And Tolkien writes a story that's terrible called The Lost Road.
Yeah.
That it becomes the Numenor myth,
yeah,
but only after like rehashing a gazillion times.
Yeah.
And that just underlines like Tolkien was forever frustrated by Lewis's kind of slapdash confidence,
How easy he could tell a story.
He wrote basically one draft by hand, longhand, and then went back and made some edits and then he kind of moved on. He just rarely, from what he says, revised things the way Tolkien did.
Yeah.
You as part of your research, you also made a trip to the Wade.
I did, yes.
Yeah. What did you find at the Wade that was of interest?
I did not know what to expect, and so I took tons of visual cues from stuff in the Wade scenario. In fact, there's a Wade Easter egg in there. Lewis's teacup that's in the collection room is in one of the scenes at the kilns. Along with the wardrobe. I basically illustrated the wardrobe just like this one, settling the controversy forever.
That's right.
That's it.
And we
I've
thank
done
you.
it.
We thank you.
Yes. No. You have the right and true claim to the one cross or whatever.
Have you seen the illustration that Lewis drew of hedgehogs?
Yes.
In the letter to Barfield?
Absolutely.
Okay. It's one of my favorite things that he ever drew.
They were both extremely visual.
Yeah.
Like it's one of the things that's not talked about with them. Obviously the boxing stuff and Lewis's world building. They were both Lewis talked about seeing images, not ideas, right? It's just, they're very interesting.
So I actually wanted to ask you a question along those lines. So in the time that they were writing, illustrations and photos were a lot more expensive than they are today. We were talking actually before we got started about AI and generative art and things like that. They didn't have access to any of those kinds of things back then. And so for them, writing was the cheapest way to tell a story. And, you commented like Tolkien was like, well, you're not supposed to illustrate these things, but then he illustrated them himself. What do you think the impact of their literature would have been, or their storytelling would have been, if they would have done this at a different time period? Maybe when illustration and writing or movies was more accessible, right? Because you have a whole generation of people that are coming up now.
Oh, yeah.
And rather than the cheapest way to get something across is by writing it by hand in word form, sometimes it's, movies and illustrations and graphic novels and things like that.
Or you take a story prompt and you put it into ChatGPT and you're like, write me a deep, 10,000 word mythology about this.
Exactly. Yeah. How do you think the sort of format shaped their storytelling, and then what do you see the impact of sort of the evolution? Because like you said, every time somebody has done a visual format for Lord of the Rings, it's helped to add to this visual language to the point now, if somebody came out with something and they came up with a new visual language for the Lord of the Rings, we would probably all reject it immediately off. We're like, no, that's not Lord of the Rings. But we would just intuitively know that's not what it looks like.
Because it's not Alan Lee's Lord of the Rings, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up with the Tolkien calendar. So like the Hildenbrand, like that's like when I see those stuff, and I've got that in my talk tonight I'm going to talk about. But the visual culture of Tolkien is fascinating. And I have actually a whole talk I've given called the Glyphic Tolkien, which is an argument about how he could square that circle of like, these shouldn't be illustrated, but I'm illustrating them. And just very, very briefly, there's two ways of making images. Glyphic, which is more like shape language. Imagine like the Nike logo, right?
Okay.
And then there is the Vedudic, and think of like a Bierstadt landscape painting, right?
Yeah.
And I think what Tolkien was saying is that landscape painting robs the imagination. Whereas the glyphic stuff, and if you look at his work, it is more glyphic. It's more like design. And I think deep down he was a designer. And he was making designed images, not landscape paintings. And so I think that's how he felt like it worked, or it created more of a decorative, like all the little decorative, like windmill shapes he would do in the newspaper. I don't know if you've ever seen him like do the crossword and then like draw all over newspaper. That's he was just basically had a designer's mind. And it makes sense because he liked letter forms and language. Right. And so anyway, I think that's how you get to that conclusion in his mind.
Gotcha.
But I do think it would be a very different world if The Lord of the Rings came out today versus then, for sure.
Yeah.
So listeners who are familiar with graphic novels might know the name Scott McCloud, who wrote a book called Understanding Comics back in, I think, 1993.
Yeah.
And so that's been out for 30 some years. And that book is really about, it's almost like the theory of graphic novels and comic strips. I learned a lot from that.
Yeah. It's like a meta conversation where you're using comics to talk about why comics exist and what they do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Where is the conversation about graphic novels and comics gone since Scott McCloud wrote that book?
It's still basically the text of like when you teach young people about comics and why they work. I mean, that stuff obviously has been around in art schools for years, but Scott McCloud distilled it in such a graspable and clear way. And he innovated some things, the 6-panel transition types. Yeah. That was new. So there's still a lot that people use, and that is still a primary resource.
When you're creating your own graphic novels, what are some things that readers might want to look for as they're kind of enjoying the text?
I mean, it's funny. I think there's like whenever you make something, there's the analytical side and then the intuitive side, right? And both are valuable. So like color theory is one. Like, okay, I know how color theory works, and that can be one way I evaluate if this page is working. But then there's the intuitive side that's just like, I don't know, it's not working. I want that to be yellow, right? And so artists tend to be either one or the other. But of course you need a balance. And so, like the color story in this book is really important. There's some really thoughtful color theory going on there. Like the values are all chosen very specifically, so you could almost photocopy the book and it would still read as a clear value structure. But there's also a kind of intuitive approach that like the book is about a eucatastrophe, and I picked purple and yellow, which are traditional Easter colors, right? So there's a little bit of a like, it's not really there to grasp in that way, but it might ping something in your subconscious about why I picked those colors. So again, all graphic novels use the visual tools, are something that they should sort of be, in the famous words of a type essay, the crystal goblet. Like they're there to hold the stuff, but they should be sort of transparent, Yeah.
There was a great review about this book in the New York Times by Lev Grossman, and he talked about the color.
I cried in a Starbucks after I read it.
Did you really?
Because the Times, they don't tell you when it's coming. Like some of the other reviews, like you get a little bit of a warning. But this was just like, my editor was like, Lev Grossman. And I was like, oh my gosh. I was between school visits in New York City. So yeah.
And one of the comments is about the colors. I'm going to read it.
Okay.
He says, Hendrix lays all this out, the story of Lewis and Tolkien, out in eloquent prose and charming expressive drawings, colored in moody blues and purples and warm, appropriately dragonish gold. And I thought that just
amazing.
Captured. It was beautiful.
It's great.
And I love the colors in the story. I was thinking about the golden sessions.
Yeah.
These conversations among Lewis and Tolkien and friends. They, talking about how wonderful those were, and those pages are painted in gold or drawn in
course.
gold. It's just so fantastic.
Well, the gold was easy to start with because I was like, I got a lion, right? And then it was like, okay, I wasn't sure what archetype to use for Tolkien because a lot of people have asked, like, so you think Lewis is Aslan in his stories and Gandalf is Tolkien? I'm like, no. I'm just using like these archetypes.
Yeah.
And so, for Tolkien, I was thinking it could be a king or like an elf. But like I got to wizard, and I was like, "This has got to be it." Plus, they had kind of a odd couple, or like Abbott and Costello, just like the visual shapes.
Yeah.
So it was kind of immediate once I got to wizard.
And then you've got some secondary characters too in the back matter, like Dr. Thistle.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you for talking about Dr. Thistle
and the raccoon
and Gene the raccoon.
Gene the raccoon. Yeah.
Those are basically. So my dad's name is Gene, and he when we were kids did this raccoon magic trick that was very infamous in our house, and so that's a little nod to him. And then Dr. Thistle's basically Dorothy Sayers because it frustrated me that there were no women really in this book because the Inklings were extremely male. So, and honestly, Dorothy Sayers should have been in the Inklings. So I wanted her to appear sort of somewhere in this.
Well, she's part of the Wade Center.
Well, yeah, that's right. So we accept that.
Yeah,
You've done things right.
So I have one final question for you. What will it take for you to illustrate Paralandra for me in a way that is
I know.
Christian friendly? It is my favorite Lewis novel, and I don't think it's ever going to get turned into any sort of visual medium. Obviously, there's the challenge
tragically
of the Green Lady.
under illustrated.
Yeah.
All the space trilogy.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's call HarperCollins.
Okay.
I'm on the case.
Because there's the scene where he's floating in the water when he first lands on Venus, and he's talking about it like this medieval painting with the gold background and stuff. I mean, it's just, it's ripe for illustration. But
it is. It's almost too weird to illustrate, which is part of why maybe people have stayed away from it. But yeah, the space trilogy I've always thought is tragically under-visualized.
Yeah.
I've got one final question for you too, and the kind of general version of it is why do you draw? But the more specific version is a lot of your books explore figures who are Christians, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Lewis and Tolkien, and then of course you've got a book about Jesus.
Yeah,
could you talk a little bit about how your faith informs what you're doing?
Yeah, I think if you had told the 18-year-old version of myself that I would be making like Christian-themed books, like I would have been shocked and horrified. Like not because of the content, but just because the stuff I saw in Christian bookstores at that time. It's not that it was bad; it was just supremely uninteresting, right? And so I think that's the biggest sin of Christian art in the '90s it was just beige,
Yeah.
So now, though, in the past 10 years especially, there has been so much made that is just it's just weird or unusual or challenging in terms of the visual representation of these stories. So it's fun for me to try to challenge some of what we think of in terms of the visual nature, especially of retelling a Bible story, which is I did a book of sort of retelling Jesus's parables, and trying to punch up the words of Jesus is not a task anyone should try. So again, I take that very seriously. But again, I'm
You're
really
edit the Gospels.
Yeah, I'm like, you know what? You could have been a little tighter with this, Jesus. No, what I really want is to make the images, right? And so the words, I'm sort of an accidental writer, or at least that's what I say. I'm often a little sheepish about my prose, but I really want to get to the pictures, and that's kind of why I write.
Well, I mean, some of those one of my favorite paintings is the Parable of the Prodigal Son by Rembrandt. It's a story. It's this beautiful visual. That's
it does something
open
different
your Bible
to our mind.
and it's screaming out for somebody to draw it. And so those
right.
kinds of moments, definitely.
And Jesus was an artist, at least a narrative artist. The parables were works of art.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's several passages where I just read the one in John 8 where the Pharisees challenge him about the woman caught in adultery. Like, do you want to stone her now, Christ? And he does not respond, but instead writes or draws in the sand.
Yeah.
What?
I know.
What a weird...
If I could time travel, I would go back to that moment to see what he's drawing in the sand.
I'm doing my next project's about the Salem witch trials. So this passage pings a little bit with that.
Oh, yeah.
So I just read a commentary about that. There are all these really well-researched research theories about what that could have been.
Oh, yes.
Like, was he writing the Pharisees' names in the sand?
Yeah.
Was he writing Old
Their
Testament
sins.
scriptures? There's people that believe that Jesus probably could not write. So the leading assumption is that he was literally drawing. And again, I could think about this for 2 weeks. I love it.
And then there's also just the act of drawing is silent, right? So the silence is speaking volumes. These huge pauses are just amazing.
Yeah, he's just letting them dangle. Yeah. And then he's not even looking at them. He's like, I just got a doodle down here, man.
Powerful stuff.
Oh, wow.
Right. Well, thank you for your book.
Oh, no, thank you.
Thank you, John. Thanks for your time, too. If you want to hear more from John Hendrix, head over to the Wade's YouTube channel. You can listen to his talk at the Wade Center. Thanks again for being with us, John.
Glad to be here.
Until next time, friends.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.